12th century, the Third Crusade. Two great leaders would come to symbolize the struggle between the empires of Islam and Christianity. Saladin, the Arab world's greatest champion, and Richard the Lionheart, Christendom's finest warrior. Divided by religion, they would be brought together in holy war. Driven by honor, obsessed with fame and power, Richard and Saladin would ascend into legend, fighting for the sacred city of Jerusalem. Based on the latest research from both Muslim and Christian sources, this is their story. In 1187, a Muslim army battered at the gates of Jerusalem. United behind Saladin, the most powerful commander they'd ever had. For 4 generations, the holy city had been in the hands of the Christian infidel. Now Saladin was poised to reclaim Jerusalem for the Muslim world. Inside the holy city, the Christian population panicked. Mothers hacked off their daughters' hair in the hope that Saladin's men wouldn't rape them. Monks hid their sacred icons. They had good reason to be terrified. Saladin was driven on by the terrible events of the First Crusade, 88 years earlier. Following an appeal from the Catholic Church, the First Crusaders had ripped Jerusalem from the heart of the Islamic world, slaughtering every living thing in the name of their Christian God.
The First Crusader invasion of Jerusalem was horrific. A lot of blood was shed for no reason. The amount of bloodshed was not based on military needs, but rather to create terror.
Now, Saladin had gathered his own terrifying army. He believed that soon Jerusalem and victory would be his. Islam could take its revenge for the First Crusade. But Saladin knew very little of the remote corner of the world that had spawned the Crusaders. Europe.
Europe was considered to be a cold, foggy, ambiguous place where people actually didn't have a clear idea how to govern themselves. Their religion wasn't clear to them, and they didn't have a proper culture or civilization. And what the Arabs had in mind was philosophy, medicine, music, literature, poetry. And the Europeans were thought to lack all of these things.
Contrary to Arab belief, Western society was increasingly sophisticated and strong. Valuing military skill above all else, it bred ever more deadly warriors, determined to hold on to Jerusalem. The man who would one day be Saladin's nemesis was one of Europe's most proud, feared, and powerful princes, Richard of England. Richard's heroic deeds would one day earn him the title Lionheart.
Richard was the member of a fractious, violent family that ruled England and northern France in the 12th century. He was very strong through his bravery, through his astuteness, through his intelligence. He was somebody who was admired and respected throughout the known world.
A devout Catholic, Richard came from an intensely religious society, obsessed with Jerusalem. The Holy City was thousands of miles away, but it was the epicenter of his faith. Here, Jesus Christ had lived and died. Since the First Crusade, generations of knights had fought to keep it in Christian hands.
It was a deeply felt belief within Christian society at this time that if the land on which Christ had walked, if the city in which he was buried was not in Christian hands, that was an affront to their God, that their God would feel that they had let him down. Also, if Jerusalem was in the hands of men of another faith, the pilgrim route to Jerusalem might be barred for generations unless you controlled that route and the holy city itself.
Prince Richard knew he had an obligation to Jerusalem, that he might be called on to become a crusader. As he honed his skills fighting Christian rivals in Europe, the Holy City was never far from his mind. Jerusalem was in Richard's blood. His great-grandfather had been king of the Holy City. His father, the King of England, sent huge sums of money to the Holy Land. Even his mother had been on crusade. It was natural that Richard would follow in his ancestors' crusading footsteps. While Richard was still a child, Saladin was a young man in his 20s. As a polo-playing cavalry officer, he never imagined a future as one of the Arab world's greatest heroes. He wasn't even an Arab.
We know that he was born in 1137 in Tikrit, the birthplace of Saddam Hussein. His family were Kurds. He was, to some extent anyway, an ethnic outsider in the lands where he became so powerful.
As Saladin came of age, descendants of the first European crusaders, known as the Franks, were fortifying their new kingdom of Jerusalem. Their growing network of crusader castles was a clear sign that they intended to stay and colonize Arab territory. But the Arab world did nothing. It was paralyzed by internal conflicts.
There wasn't a unity of purpose in the Arab world. It took the Arabs and the Muslims a long time to work out a formula by which they can actually counterattack. And this didn't happen until after the First Crusade had taken deep roots in society.
As a young man, Saladin was under the command of his warrior uncle, Shirkuh, in Egypt. In time, Saladin would unite the feuding factions of the Arab world and take on the Crusaders. But like Richard, he began his rise to power, fighting his neighbors. As Egypt's ruler, Shirkuh ordered Saladin to stamp out his Muslim rivals. An unlikely beginning for Islam's holiest of warriors. But a twist of fate would change his life forever. Shirkuh died from overeating. As his nephew, Saladin took command.
It slowly dawned on him that he was destined for leadership and that this suited him, and people were willing to follow his leadership, and he built on it.
Egypt was the richest country in the Middle East, the perfect power base for a young warrior.
As soon as he became ruler of Egypt, Salah ad-Din conceived of the idea of setting up a monarchy. However, at the start, he did not have plans to liberate Jerusalem, but rather he desired a vast kingdom, an empire.
Saladin spent the next decade attacking his Muslim neighbors. With the might of Egypt behind him, he brought Arabia and Syria under his control. Only a small enclave was left untouched. The Crusader-occupied Kingdom of Jerusalem. After many years of fighting, Saladin was the most powerful man in the Middle East. But now approaching 50, he was criticized by Muslim holy men.
A number of clerics and religious scholars started criticizing him and asked, "For how long will you keep fighting for power?" People were asking him to stop the bloodshed of Muslims. They said, "Enough is enough."
Driven by ambition, Saladin had killed many Muslims on his rise to power. Now he searched for a way to atone and show he was also a pious man. The answer only came to him after a near-death experience. In the spring of 1185, he fell gravely ill. On the brink of death, Saladin called his holy men to him.
Salah ad-Din lived in the religious atmosphere. He believed in the mystical power of holy men and supernatural actions or miracles.
While listening to his holy men read from the Quran, Saladin had a revelation.
He became obsessed with the idea of liberating Jerusalem, and that such a task would bring him forgiveness of his sins and God's rewards.
As Saladin began to recover, His belief that God had spared him from death so that he could retake Jerusalem dominated his thoughts. He started to realize how he could both do God's will and unite the Arab world under his leadership. He would use the power of religion to create an indignant rage in the people of Islam. He would call for a jihad, a righteous struggle in which all good Muslims were obliged to rid the occupied territory of the infidels. Saladin spread news of his jihad throughout the Middle East. His scribes wrote of a new holy war. Saladin wanted to remind everyone of the importance of Jerusalem to the Muslims. It was the place where the Prophet Muhammad went to heaven to speak to God. The holy city had to be taken back.
He used religion because that's all they had. This is the culture. So he used what was available to him, and he used it effectively in a positive sense. He wasn't manipulating religion, but there was nothing else. This was the only element which could bring people together and make them feel that there was an ideal they were striving for.
Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought news of Saladin's rise to power and the precarious position of the Franks in Jerusalem. But Richard and Christendom's other European leaders were preoccupied fighting each other. They felt they could spare no men to intervene in the Holy Land. For Saladin, it was the perfect time to act.
Once Saladin had built up this confederation of people from Egypt, Damascus and northern Syria, and created this moral pressure on people to join in his jihad, he then had to deliver. There was an immediacy, a need for him to fight the Christians in 1187, otherwise the confederation would break up.
Inside the holy city of Jerusalem, the occupying Franks feared the united Islamic forces. They'd written to the Pope and kings in Europe, begging for help, but received no response. Now, in the summer of 1187, they took the terrifying decision to fight Saladin alone.
It's not a decision that people took very often in the Middle Ages. To risk a battle against so successful a commander with such great resources at his disposal as Saladin had, meant that you were taking 3-4 times the normal terrible risk.
The Franks in Jerusalem put their faith in an extraordinary weapon. A fragment of wood on which they believed Christ was crucified. To medieval Christians, the true cross was imbued with great power. They had taken it into battle more than 20 times and won. Heartened by the presence of the true cross, the Knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched out to face Saladin. This was exactly what Saladin had hoped for. Luring the Franks away from the safety of Jerusalem's walls, he drew them 20 miles into the barren hills of Hattin. Here, he had poisoned the few sources of fresh water. Saladin had them trapped. Now, at Hattin, he would confirm his authority amongst the other Arab leaders by unleashing his great Islamic army on the Franks. He ordered his troops to attack and torch the Crusader camp. Thousands of Christian knights were slaughtered. At Hattin, Saladin destroyed the bulk of the Franks' army. The true cross was also his. But Saladin did not destroy the Christians' great religious symbol.
To Saladin personally, the true cross was a worthless piece of wood. As a Muslim, he believed that Christ was a prophet, but he did not believe that he was the Son of God, and therefore he could not attach the same spiritual significance as the Christians did to this object. Saladin was aware, however, that the Christians were highly attached to the true cross, and if he was going to surrender it, he would want something very, very worthwhile in return.
The true cross might prove useful to Saladin, but the jihad was not yet over. Jerusalem was still in Christian hands. It took 2 months for news to reach Europe from the Holy Land. Word of Saladin's victory at Hattin brought an increasing sense of unease to Richard of England. He knew the road to Jerusalem would now be wide open for Saladin. The holy city could fall, and he would not know about it until it was too late. Richard's worst nightmare was about to come true. Just weeks after his victory at Hattin, Saladin reached Jerusalem. His defining moment as a holy warrior had come.
Salah ad-Din wanted Jerusalem, not just because of the importance of the city to Islam. The message of the first Crusaders had been, liberate Jerusalem from the barbaric Muslims. Salah ad-Din wanted to neutralize that message.
Jerusalem was at Saladin's mercy. As liberator of Jerusalem, Saladin guaranteed his place in history. But it was his treatment of the Christian population that would make him a legend. Saladin decided not to cleanse Jerusalem with Christian blood. He preferred rose water. Muslim soldiers turned their energies to purifying the holy places. On Saladin's orders, the Christian descendants of the first Crusaders were allowed to live.
Salah ad-Din softened the sharp calls for revenge. After capturing the city, he said, nobody will be killed. He banned the killing.
Saladin aimed to show that Islam was militarily and morally superior to the Christian faith.
Saladin decided to teach the Crusaders a lesson. That was that when you conquer a city, you show mercy and you show the values of your faith as being superior to those of the enemy. And that was the lesson of Jerusalem in 1187.
For the first time in 88 years, Muslims could pray in Jerusalem.